Now it's time to introduce our speaker. But did you know that the first Antipode lecture was actually 21 years ago at the RGS IBG when Tariq Ali spoke to Antipode? We've been doing this for a long time. And since that time, we've had the privilege of hearing from a number of geographers, including Doreen Massey, Cindy Katz, Jillian Hart, David Harvey, Laura Polito, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and many others. And we've also invited a number of scholars from outside the discipline, but whose work has contributed quite a lot to debates that we're having within geography, including Paul Gilroy, Gayatri Spivak, Marshall Berman, Lisa Lowe, and most recently Sylvia Federici and Glenn Coulthard. Glenn Coulthard gave the Antipode lecture this past July at the meeting of the New Zealand-Australia geographers in Auckland. And so we're pleased to introduce another scholar who's technically outside the discipline, but whose work has been widely read within, Professor Kristen Ross. Her many honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship and fellowships from the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Among Professor Ross's many publications are four important books on French politics and culture. Communal Luxury, The Political Imaginary of the Paris Commune, which Verso published. May 68 and Its Afterlife, published by the University of Chicago Press. Fast Cars, Clean Bodies, Decolonization and the Reordering of French Culture, published by MIT. The Emergence of Social Space, Rimbaud and the Paris Commune, published by the University of Minnesota Press. Her translation of the Mauvaise Troupe collectives The Zad and Notav, Territorial Struggles and the Making of a New Political Intelligence, was published by Verso last year. The title of her talk today is The Seventh Wonder of the Zad. So please join me in welcoming Professor Kristen Ross.
Thank you. In 2016, I was invited to the site of the longest-lasting political struggle in post-war French history. This was the occupation of a small stretch of farmland and wetlands outside of Nantes, whose aim, which was ultimately successful, was to block the construction of an international airport on that site. The inhabitants of the Zad, as the occupation came to be known, asked me to discuss with them the continuities and discontinuities between the 1871 insurrection in the heart of the capital, known as the Paris Commune, and what was occurring there at Notre-Dame-des-Landes. They were interested, as I am, in the form and practices of free communes, in questions of decentralization and ways of creating a regional self-sufficiency that is not a closing in on itself. Their interest in the 19th century event and the time I subsequently spent at the Zad was remarkable to me in a number of ways. For one thing, it reconfirmed something that I had argued in my book, Communal Luxury, that the return after 2011 throughout the world to a political strategy based on seizing space or rendering space public had caused the commune to enter forcefully into the figuration of the present as a laboratory of political invention, a kind of usable archive of legacy ideas and practices. And it had another effect of a historical nature as well. For me, it changed profoundly how I thought about the history of the recent past. The Zad made visible a whole alternative world history of the last half of the last century, a history in which place-based battles against government seizure or management of land emerge as the definitive battles of our age. Recent occupational movements firmly anchored in a particular region or territory, like the Zad, or like pipeline struggles in the Americas, such as Standing Rock, make it possible to see a distinctly new political sensibility emerging sometime toward the end of the last century. It is as if throughout the world people began to realize that the tension between the logic of development and that of the ecological bases of life had become the primary contradiction ruling their lives. The 10-year struggles in the 1970s of farmers in the Larzac region of France and their supporters fighting the government appropriation of their land to be used as an army training ground, or the equally lengthy and much more bloody battle of farmers on the outskirts of Tokyo trying, with the help of radical students, to prevent their land from becoming the site of the Narita airport, can now be seen as among the most emblematic struggles of the second half of the 20th century in the following sense. The two movements mark the beginning of a political sensibility that brings together the will to change the social rules of an unequal world with that of preserving or conserving or caring for or defending the living, the ecological bases of society. Like the indigenously led land-based struggles occurring in the Americas and in Australia, these were movements that drew on political ecology not in a particular environmentalist sense, but as a rethinking of and a challenge to the existing order of relations of humans among themselves and to other organisms. They could not, as such, be dismissed as NIMBYism. They were the sign instead that the relations we maintain with the living would now be at the heart of any political movement of significance. In this sense, we could say that defending the conditions for life on the planet became sometime around the middle of the last century the new and incontrovertible horizon of meaning of all political struggle. Now, the Zod's existence, oops, these are maps of the Zod. I thought I better have some maps given who I was speaking to. They're pretty fanciful. They're kind of hard to see, but the Zod's existence, as much as a shared territory as a movement, with both aspects held equally dear, was thus for me a forceful reminder that to gain ground in the fight against enclosure, for this is what the fight is all about, we actually need to gain ground. That is, we need to put our feet someplace, to remain someplace, to retreat into and defend someplace, even if it is only a semi-arable stretch of land, which the French government, when it designated it as the site of a future airport, consistently described, much to the surprise of the farmers living and cultivating there, as a desert. Space-specific, geographically defined struggles have a kind of refreshing flat-footedness about them. David Harvey has suggested that this is because the fact of being bound to a particular space creates an either-or dialectic, something quite distinct from a transcendental or Hegelian one. Demands, concerns, and aspirations that are place-specific in nature create a situation that calls for an existential and political choice. One is either for the airport or against it. In the words of Karl Marx to Vera Zasulich, writing in the context of an earlier rural battle against the state, quote, "It is a question no longer of a problem to be solved, but simply of an enemy to be beaten. It is no longer a theoretical problem. It is quite simply an enemy to be beaten. A 57-kilometer tunnel will either be drilled through the Alps for a high-speed train line, or it will not. An airport will either be built on farmland, or it is not." What does it mean to create a territory, and what does it mean to defend one? Why is defending more generative of solidarity, and thus more pragmatic and far-reaching, than the political verb we hear mentioned so much more frequently, namely resisting? It may seem odd that someone like myself, trained in literature and aesthetics and art, should pose such a question, but it should not be surprising. The perception available to a geographer on the one hand, and to an artist or someone preoccupied by art on the other, bears a significant overlap. For both, the physical environment can never be reduced to mere background or abstract space. The world for both can never be a warehouse of inert things piled up for later use. One reason I have had such frequent recourse to geographical perspectives and ways of framing questions is that geography for me becomes a means of approaching landscapes with a sensitivity to what state boundaries obscure, unexpected natural formations, and modes of life that spring up below the radar of authority. The Zad, as I came to learn, was nothing if not another such laboratory for the creation of a parallel world. And the dotted line there is what the government set up to be the space of the future airport. A parallel world, a truly revolutionary experiment, and one of those that reconfigures the fight lines of an era. What I saw there could easily come under the heading of a commune in the making, if by commune we understand a group of people dwelling in a given space who take their existence in hand and manage their affairs together in rupture with the existing social and economic order. Communal practices, whether in Paris in 1871 or Chiapas today, imply staying in place and standing in the way. And by doing so, creating alternatives in the here and now, distinct, more or less self-reliant and semi-autonomous zones or territories. They embody the power of collectivity with the ideal of self-determination and reliance. Taking a position, as Harvey's remarks make clear, is not just central to the issue, it is the issue. I accepted the invitation to go down to the Zad, and for me the visit was an extraordinary moment. We had our discussion about communal practices. It was very animated. The French media at that point was busy portraying the inhabitants of the Zad as though they were, the characters out of the Mad Max trilogy. But in fact, what I saw there was a very different and varied group of people, old people, babies. They were very well read, they had varied and profound experiences and skills, and they knew what interested them. We were not concerned with writing any linear or progressive history, joining the Commune to contemporary movements like the Zad. We tried rather to talk about the Commune as, the Paris Commune as an integral part of its own historical moment, but also in a way that exceeded its own history and that could suggest to us possible futures. Even the projects that the communards could not complete, like federation or an enduring regional self-sufficiency, for example, projects that were forced to remain at the level of a dream or an intention, could then be seen to have profound significance for contemporary struggles like Notre-Dame-des-Landes. And what was surprising to me was not so much our discussion, but rather the way that it unfolded. I thought we would just get right to it, but we had to wait first for people to come back who were demonstrating in Paris against the labor laws, and then they came back, but more pressingly, there was a herd of cows that had to be moved from one field to another on the other side of the Zad, and these cows were very easy, but there were some horses there also that they had to be moved, and they were unbroken, and they escaped in the woods and had to be caught. All of this taking quite a bit of time. So it wasn't until the end of the day that we sat outside in the sun in a lovely space near where the bread was being baked. This is their flour machine. And the bread came out of the ovens. Just then, we had our discussion with warm bread to share. Now, while this anecdote gives some idea of the interplay between intellectual and manual labor at the Zad, it would nonetheless be nothing more than a nice folkloric scenario if the Zad were not also a place of struggle. In fact, it was the constant revertibility of the Zad between a place for living and a place for struggle between dwelling and combat, which made it such a thorn in the side of the state in recent years. Now, it is clear that what matters for the world of international airports is a smooth and seamless transit between substitutable spaces. What matters for a territory? The making of a territory has everything to do with a logic of difference and possibility, autonomy, and self-determination. Old, rather unfashionable notions like aura and authenticity associated with singularity and identity come back into play, but with a difference. For if the Zad has an aura, it has been constructed over time by the actions of many. Its authenticity created through the possibilities of common life that place-based social relations perpetuate, even amidst a striking diversity of beliefs and identities. The making of a territory is the making of a place that precisely cannot be exchanged for any other. Where the Zad's fight began first with the airport, it was no longer with high-speed transport per se, but with the world of high-speed transport, a world of class division that identifies human progress with economic growth and defines human needs in terms of markets and the submission of all markets, all the world's resources to markets. Preventing one's territory from becoming a mere node in a global capitalist system, a space of pure transit where people do nothing more than just pass through, is a way of stabilizing in time, and perhaps even with luck, a lifetime, a way of life that lies at least partially outside of and against the state and the market. Resistance, to return to the question I asked at the beginning of this talk, means that the battle, if there ever was one, has already been lost. We can only try helplessly to resist the overwhelming power that we attribute to the other side. Defending, on the other hand, means that there is already something on our side that we possess, that we value, that we cherish, and that is thereby worth fighting for. Resistance unites a community by erecting a power to oppose, Donald Trump, to use a familiar example, rather than forcing a community to interact with each other in meaningful enough ways to determine and decide what it is. Defending is much more difficult and more fruitful to pursue to the extent that it obliges a community to think through what it is and isn't, not in identitarian or ideological ways, but rather according to what it values and considers worth defending. I don't know how much you are familiar with the history of the Zad, so I thought I would just give you a brief history. Back in the early 1970s, at the height of the post-war modernization frenzy, known in France as the Trente Glorieuses, that was the moment that the project to build an airport outside of Nantes was first dreamed up. It was a ridiculous project from the outset because Nantes, which is only 15 kilometers away, already has an international airport. So this was a completely redundant construction. So people living in the zone designated for its construction were supposed to agree to see themselves as obsolete and simply disappear, but something else happened. Farmers refused to leave their land and were quickly joined by nearby inhabitants who threw themselves energetically into citizen actions like studies, lobbying, legal maneuvering to counteract the expertise of the pro-airport advocates. The first squatters arrived in 2008, and from that point on, the ZAD, and that's bureaucracy speak, that's Zone d'Aménagement Différé, ZAD, in the language of the government, became a ZAD, Zone à Défendre. So they kept the letters, but changed the acronym into a combative acronym. It is important to recall that the arrival of the squatters, many of whom morphed into permanent occupiers, was desired. The cohabitation was successful. It wasn't at all seamless or conflict-free, but it was a graft of three very distinct groups: occupiers, farmers, townspeople. The beginning of what has been the Zod's greatest challenge and ongoing achievement of solidarity in extreme diversity. And I want to talk about that especially. But I mentioned earlier that the primary difference separating the land-based struggles like Chiapas or Standing Rock in the Americas are indigenously led. In Europe, instead, there's an improbable assortment of different components. At the Zod, it was old historic farmers, young, more radical farmers, petty bourgeois shopkeepers, elected officials, black bloc anarchists, naturalists who don't even believe in farming. And no one group was in any kind of a leadership role. So unlike, say, something like Standing Rock, where you have a clear leadership of the indigenous people. This has created a very different kind of movement than those ideologically based struggles familiar in the history of the left. One that is, in its desire to hold together the diverse but equal components that make it up, requires, as one Zod dweller put it, more tact than tactics. And they themselves have called this process whereby of bringing together this improbable group of very different kinds of people, they call it composition. And composition was really born with the Zod. The kind of social base it creates is distinct, essentially a working alliance involving many disidentifications, a working alliance that is also the sharing of a physical territory, a living space. Composition is the mark of a massive investment in organizing life in common without the exclusions in the name of ideas, identities, or ideologies that we so frequently encounter in radical milieu. If the Zod is perhaps the best example of an open conflict that has managed to endure and to build for itself duration in the midst of struggle, then it has everything to do with this process. Composition is nothing more than the fruits of an unexpected meeting between separate worlds and the promise contained in the becoming commune of that meeting. It is thus a space or a process where even antagonisms create an attachment. Composition is the way that autonomous forces unite and associate with each other, sometimes complementing each other, sometimes contradicting each other, but always in the end dependent on each other. When it works, these different elements strive to recognize each other and work together in pursuit of common desires that surpass each of them, rather than trying to resolve their differences. And so what I'm talking about is really a situation where you don't try to convince the other people in the group that your way is superior. And so this amounts to a lot of very different ways of going about the struggle. So on the one hand, it might be sabotage, it might be a purely legal procedure where you block the courtrooms. You might be cataloging endangered species. You might be having frontal, vicious battles with the police. But everyone is just essentially doing their own thing and not trying to convince others of the superiority. So this is especially important in a movement whose enemies try ceaselessly to divide and conquer by setting one group up against another. The strength of the movement derives precisely from its diverse makeup, which in the case of the Zod has allowed it to express itself through all different kinds of actions, like blocking highways with tractors, to legal maneuvering, to very violent demonstrations. So composition is the creation and maintaining of solidarity in diversity. Solidarity among people of disparate ideologies, identities, and beliefs, whose coming together and staying together adds up to no final orthodoxy. So you have just a kind of continuing internal eclecticism. This eclecticism and the disagreements it constantly produces can be exhausting and often aggravating, so why make the effort? Because the power of the movement resides in a certain excess. The excess of creating something that is more than the sum of ourselves, something that only the composition between our differences makes possible. United in their opposition to the airport, each group nevertheless proceeded for many years along its own path. They were what the Zapatistas call a world where many worlds fit. And it was not until the fall of 2012 that the state launched a full-scale military invasion of the ZAD in a brutally violent but ultimately failed attempt to evacuate the zone. It was at that point that the plurality of conjugated actions and components began to think of themselves as one movement. The experience of the physical confrontation with the police during the one-month siege, the solidarity it engendered between groups that came to rely on each other in combat, the rebuilding and reoccupation phase afterwards, when 40,000 supporters from all over France and Europe, incensed by the display of state violence, showed up to help rebuild the dwelling places on the ZAD. It is thus the ability of the ZAD, like the two long land-based movements I mentioned earlier, the Larzac in France and the anti-Narita airport movement in Japan. It is thus their ability to have stabilized in time and to continue to make new creative ways of inhabiting conflict that has been its perhaps most interesting characteristic. Its sheer duration, you could say that the ZAD lasted for 50 years. I mean, the project for the airport started in '68, along with Antipode, apparently. But it was really only the last 10 years that you had this mix of people with the occupiers and everything. But 10 years is a long time. It's a lot longer than Taksim or Madrid or Occupy Oakland or any of the shorter-lived occupations that, not coincidentally, were all urban occupations. As Pierre Kropotkin pointed out in his rewriting of the Paris Commune in his book, The Conquest of Bread, proximity to and involvement with the means of subsistence is essential not only to the duration of a movement, but to establishing lived intimacy with the territory. At the heart of that relationship is a form of embeddedness that undoes any distinction between dwelling in a territory and defending it. The state invasion did much more than cement the various components of the struggle into a newly efficient coalition. It accelerated and deepened the community's knowledge of and visceral attachment to the territory in ways that could not be anticipated, making the very act of dwelling, of subsisting, of staying put, a more forceful political act. Any place owes its character and experiences, owes its character to the experiences it affords to those who spend time or dwell there. And those experiences for the occupiers now included weeks of physical combat atop trees, in clouds of tear gas, their houses razed by tanks, bulldozers, with even the debris hauled away to destroy any memory of their existence, along with anything that could be used as a projectile against the police. What was now being defended included all the new social links and entanglements, the new physical relation to the territory, what Gaston Bachelard calls its muscular consciousness, all that the battle and the rebuilding had created, the great enthusiasm and joy that came with victory. Defending the territory now entailed defending the collective life project that had emerged there, a project that includes the very concept of territoriality itself, to the extent that it fuses the spatial and the social while nurturing a certain autonomy and will to self-determination. The territory offers the possibility of acting on the real in a manner that is at once convivial, transgressive, and pragmatic. It creates mobilization out of demobilizing. What is revolutionary about the ZAD and its inhabitants is not so much their opposition to the airport as their discovery over time of what it was that they were for, what they had to defend. And this comes largely from the experience of anchoring themselves in a symbiotic entanglement of people and place, best summed up by a slogan frequently encountered on the ZAD, nous ne défendons pas la nature, nous sommes la nature qui se défend. We do not defend nature, we are nature defending itself. And I sort of read this as a rewriting of and rephrasing of Communal geographer Élisée Reclus' famous statement, man is nature becoming conscious of itself. So I just wanted to make a little parenthetical remark now about Reclus, because he is the geographer that I've gone back to throughout everything I've written, actually, and in part because of he manifests a kind of proto-ecological sensibility that's common, well, with his friend Kropotkin. And I think that this kind of sensibility on the part of 19th century geographers is not surprising, because geographers, like historians, I don't need to tell you this, but I mean, you're concerned with the inscription of time in space, but the geographer's emphasis is obviously much more on space. And I think that that makes a big difference, because time and temporality, what historians work with, is a human construction. It's entirely human. And so it's tainted by all of the contemporary biases and prejudices that we have, or that are part of an era. Whereas I think space is much more complex, because it introduces the non-human into the equation. Non-human differences and agendas like geological formations or other species or climate or any of these things that, in other words, it forces an encounter with the non-human that is a little bit different from what historians deal with. So one of the major effects of capital is to make us disconnected from the living, transforming us into people without places, endlessly uprooted and uprootable according to the vicissitudes of the economy. And the idea that there is only one world is, in fact, the essence of capital. The world as it exists is the lone referential basis for what is possible. The question then becomes, how do we cultivate a point of view that is not that of the economy? How to get out of the impasse of political economy and its critique? For even the critique of political economy keeps us locked in the unique world of capital, and thus participates in the eradication of the plurality of worlds. When we say that the Zad makes dwelling or inhabiting into a more forceful political act, we are saying that to think our lives from the perspective of where we live, inhabiting a place and being inhabited by it, is one way to cultivate a point of view that does not begin and end with economic productivity. As a group from the Zad recently put it, if it has become so crucial for the political classes to crush the Zad, it is because the Zad constitutes an insolent demonstration of a life that is possible without them, a better life. A better life, certainly, for those fleeing the very real aggravations of life in capitalist culture. But the kind of freedom experienced in the Zad is more than just the negative freedom of retreat from an unjust world into a culture of consolation. It is just as much a launching point, which is to say that it figures a more positive, actively experimental sort of freedom. Time at the Zad moves according to task-oriented work rather than salaried labor in a world where the positive impacts of high-speed travel have long ago been dismissed as a myth. The practical business of living, building structures, caring for the animals, cultivating the fields, organizing the library, does not make for the narrow focus one might expect. During one of my visits, occupants were busy building a lighthouse in the middle of the Zad. The ocean is nowhere near. I pointed that out to him and I said, why are you building a lighthouse? I mean, is it defensive? Is it in order to see the cops when they come? No, someone answered, it's communal luxury. It's the seventh wonder of the Zad. The phrase communal luxury figures in the closing sentence of the manifesto written in 1871 by the Artists' Federation during the Paris Commune. I used it as the title of my book about the Commune. By uniting fine artists and artisans into a single artistic intelligence, an art federation, communards effectively overturned the hierarchy at the core of the artistic world. And this was the longest lasting hierarchy of art organization in France, that only fine artists, only sculptors and high painters, could sign their work. Only that counted as art. And what artisans did, what lace makers did, what people who painted ceramic pottery did, that was not art. So what the artists and artisans who bonded together during the Commune meant by communal luxury was something like the creation of public beauty, the enhancement of the lived environment in villages and towns, or the right of every person to live and work in a pleasing environment. Now, this might sound like a very small demand, but if you think about it, what they had in mind entailed not only a complete reconfiguration of our relationship to art, but to labor, social relations, nature, the lived environment as well. It meant art and beauty deprivatized, fully integrated into everyday life. The world is divided between those who have and those who don't have the luxury of playing with words and images. Communal luxury overcomes that division. A society's aesthetic resources would never again take the shape of what William Morris, Britain's most enthusiastic and creative supporter of the memory of the Commune, called that base piece of Napoleonic upholstery, the Vendôme column. This was, in other words, a full dismantling under the Commune of socially determined and ancient categories of artistic practices. Shoemaker Napoleon Gaillard, that's him. He was chief of barricade construction during the Commune. He was famous for a treatise that he had written on the art of the foot and the art of the shoe. But he took over and became the prominent barricade designer and constructor during the Commune. And he was castigated by anti-communards for his vanity. You know, they called him a vain shoemaker, the father of barricades. And they called that particular barricade the Chateau Gaillard. And he was accused by anti-communards of considering his barricades to be works of both art and luxury. And they were right. I mean, he did consider them that way, and he insisted on being photographed in front of them, in effect signing, his oeuvre. So communal luxury as practiced during the Commune or on the ZAD is thus a way of constituting an everyday aesthetics of process, the act of self-emancipation made visible. This is the woodworking atelier at the ZAD. So what seems initially like a decorative demand on the part of a few decorative artists is in fact the call for nothing short of a total reinvention of what a society values and what it's willing to defend. It's a call for the reinvention of wealth beyond exchange value or the end of luxury founded on class difference. Now, it's interesting to note that when when the French version of my book, Communal Luxury, came out, I had a big fight with the editor over there about the title, and I just wanted to call it Luxe Communal, which is a direct citation from the communards. I didn't see it as problematic. But my editor said that the adjective communal in French only conjured up images of municipal swimming pools or very boring local elections now in France. And so it didn't have any of the resonance that I thought it did. And so we argued and argued, and then I finally gave in because it's his language, so I thought he must know. But here was proof that he was wrong. Here was material and conceptual evidence that the aspirations and achievements to which artists and artisans of the Paris Commune in the last century gave the name communal luxury were not only firmly grasped by French and others today, but were being thoughtfully and creatively furthered along, lived and cultivated in a small bocage on the outskirts of Nantes. Now, I just want to have a quick afterword, and then I'll stop. As many of you probably know, the ZAD was ultimately victorious, and in January of last year, the Macron government announced that no airport would be built. They had won. The state collapsed. But it didn't collapse for long, because a few months later, the same government proved its obsession with annihilating any life that is being lived differently, and it ordered, at the cost of 400,000 euros a day, another military-style invasion of 3,000 police and soldiers in tanks launched into the zone to destroy the numerous dwelling places and communal buildings of occupiers, intent on continuing the collective farming that they had practiced during the opposition. They wanted to stay. So the scale of the military offensive against the ZAD is one measure. This is an interesting thing where they gathered up, the people of the ZAD gathered up all of the spent grenades that were used and dumped them in front of the mayor's office of Nantes. And they were arrested for littering. But look at the quantity. This was for 200 people. That was the amount, and tanks, you know. The scale of the military offensive against the ZAD is one measure of the threat the government perceived in the occupiers' collective exit from salary, labor, and consumer gratification. The threat, too, in the appeal the world they were building held to the thousands of people who came there in support with some of these deciding to stay put and make a life there. Government intransigence combined with the military occupation of the zone created an insurmountable division among occupiers between those who were willing to negotiate with the government to try to find a way to stay and continue in some form the collective experiments of the ZAD, and those who brooked no dialogue whatsoever with the state. And these were forcibly expelled by the government from the zone. For the occupiers who remain, a different phase of the struggle has unfolded as they try to secure the different habitations and practices they developed over the years and cultivate new initiatives in the battle against development for development's sake. Thank you.
Wondering about the composition. You said there are a bunch of diverse people, but I'm wondering what was the composition of the people who actually occupied the place, who took leadership positions, and if there was some kind of hierarchy within the occupation. Typically there are, you see this in occupied, and other occupations, so I'm just wondering.
Well, having sat through numerous of their general assemblies, which they, in times of crisis, and there was almost an ongoing crisis, so they had them almost every day. And some of these would last 5 or 6 hours. So it's an intense attempt to really deal with what you're talking about. And I would say that there wasn't really anyone who emerged in leadership. And there was no natural leader, except to the extent, I've been thinking about this more because I've been trying to think about how to think together something like Standing Rock and something like the ZAD. And in the relationship to the land, the historic farmers, the ones who refused to sell their land way back 50 years ago, in effect are almost like the indigenous people in that context. So there is a way in which they, without being in a leadership role in the ZAD, because I mean there were many other kinds of people who were just as forceful in their own way. I mean, the role played, for example, by naturalists was really important because they were able to make all of the arguments about endangered species, and and then also simply the occupiers, the squatters who became occupiers, they were also had an amazing amount of political experience. A lot of them came out of the anti-globalization movement in the 90s, and because of having participated in that movement, they wanted to anchor themselves somewhere. So so I would say no, that it was really true that composition worked, and that there wasn't they had to be open to everyone, and they were. Now, and those were all the people, the people actually sharing the space and living there were the older farmers, some newer farmers who had come in, and then the occupiers. And then you had the surrounding people from the area, who were mostly townspeople who were participating as well, but not living there.
What is the role of identity? You mentioned land, of course, which is very important, but I think it's a bit more than that. The ties that make people suffer a great deal and oppose forces of development, but also forces of colonialism, really, that want to evict them, is something we don't mainly speak enough about, is the role of identity that ties them together and allows them to struggle against great odds. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit about your experiences.
Well, I think that what fascinated me precisely about the ZAD was its non-identitarian, this idea of a non-identitarian coalition of very, very different people, and their ability to work together effectively without sharing necessarily even an ideology. Some of the older farmers were extremely conservative and couldn't imagine working out in a field with a bunch of, hippie women or whatever. I mean, or just differences that sound insignificant, but in the lived experience are very tense, like the whole question of dogs. There you are in a liberated zone, and half the people thought that their dogs should be able to run free. And the other half of the people are trying to raise some sheep, and the dogs are screwing with the sheep, So dogs was an insanely tense. I mean, 3 hours a night was devoted to the question of dogs alone. Or old-fashioned dairy farmers who had worked the land as dairy farmers forever, who had right next door to them a group of vegan, separatist, feminist lesbians who believed in no animal protein whatsoever in the future, and who were just out there with their garbanzo beans. And yet these groups are living together and they're subsisting, right? So that's exactly what, and this is not even, you can come up with other examples. I think also in 2018 there was a successful movement in Valparaiso in Chile that to block the government had announced it was going to transform the entire historic port area into a giant shopping mall. And the groups that came together to fight that included artists, dock workers, students, and urbanists. And again, it was a 10-year battle, and they ultimately won. But these are not, groups that are based necessarily on some sort of identity. Although again, there you have the dock workers, which is much more materially grounded in the territory, at least initially. So yeah, I mean, I am only in a way interested in something like a movement like this precisely because it does not have an identitarian base.
Before, in 2012, I was part of the resistance resisting the militarization of the ZAD. And what we were seeing, it was a very Eurocentric kind of problem, or Western European problem, was a lot of gendered issues. For example, pushing against the police, male-identified people were taking on these specific roles and using really problematic language, sexist language against the police and so on, and women were taking on basically sexual divisions of labor, really old cliched sexual divisions of labor were really manifesting themselves. So then you had a feminist movement, which I was part of, that manifested itself there, that was being accused of breaking the ZAD and for feminist reasons and so on. So I mean, they've been there for a long time, and I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate, because your analysis is wonderful and I haven't been when it gets really nice. If you could kind of confuse it a bit with those conflicts.
Yeah, I didn't want to suggest a kind of peaceful situation. The situation there was constantly filled with conflict, like the gender one that you mentioned. But when I went there, which was afterwards, what I saw was people that had really worked very, very hard to get through that and to come up with something else, with a better division of labor. And I thought that they had. See, you have an earlier history, so you know what the history of that, what it took to get there. But what I saw was quite impressive, especially in the context of France. I would say that it was the most feminist place in France where I've ever been.
That's something to think about. And just to add to that 2012 point too, like what happens in a moment of crisis, right? Like extreme crisis where the state's coming down on you every moment of the day, and what happens to your strategies around mobilizing, and how it's really dynamic. And I mean, I'm sure this happens in Chiapas, and it happens everywhere. So like my question to you as well is what happens in these kind of communal anti-capitalist arrangements when we start reproducing the oppressions between ourselves? I guess one of the thoughts.
Well, you know, as again, I would say that they're not unaware of those. Those are not left outside or something like that. They're really. I saw a lot of attempts to work through them, and as far as the crisis and these really sort of amazingly violent attacks on the part of the state and what you do in those situations and how everybody ultimately has to work together. You know, when you have in a way it's easier when the state is acting up. In some ways it's easier, you know, because you have that common enemy and you can just kind of come together better. But but what I would say is that, that's 10 years. I mean, they managed to do it for 10 years, which is quite extraordinary. And that's the thing that impresses me is this ability to live the conflict, you know, to just keep enduring. And the definitive break, in a way, came after the victory. Once it was clear that the airport wasn't going to be built, then the state said, you've got to get out, you've got to leave. And the people who wanted to stay versus the ones who had a kind of passion for defeat, you know, who were sort of more hardcore and wanted to not negotiate with the government. That was a real schism. That was essentially a civil war.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I would like to go back to a point that you made that I thought was quite interesting about the binary nature of these struggles over territory, whether a particular outcome happens or it doesn't happen. In the case of an airport, whether it gets built or not. And if in exploring this particular case and others that you mentioned, such as the one in Tokyo, if you came across outcomes where these binary forms were not reproduced and perhaps alternative imaginaries were enacted, and I'm kind of thinking about kind of within the kind of Ostrom framework of, you know, kind of alternative ways of managing resources or coming up with social structures that are, you know, neither one thing nor the other. And in this case, it clearly was just the airport did not get built. But, you know, I imagine that history is also littered with, you know, kind of different types of examples. And I just wondered if you did find any of those variations.
Well, I guess when I put it that way, that an airport is either built or not, I'm actually thinking about, you know, these statistics that you hear, like that by the middle of this century, the amount of arable land per person on the planet will be 1/4 what it was in the 1960s. So then, you know, then it becomes, when I hear things like that, then I tend to see things like farmland or airport. You know, once that cement goes down, that's X acres of farmland that no longer exists. And that, I think we do have to keep something like that in mind. But as far as what you described as an alternative way of arranging things, in a way that's what the ZOD has even now is, you know, because half of them are still there and they're still demanding to be allowed to conduct the kind of collective farming that they've developed with the other farmers, and, you know, so they are something different. But they are now, in order to do that, they have to negotiate with the government. So that is not the kind of binary that on one level that I suggested.
So you opened with the anecdote about going to the ZOD to talk about the Commune. Could you say a little bit more about the histories that those at the ZOD are interested in? are there particular choices being made about the histories that are being mobilised?
Yeah.
Because we know in the context of Occupy and other places that the protesters really know their history and they're deeply strategic in mobilising the particular histories that might offer best ends.
Yeah.
So can you say a little bit more about why the Commune and potentially others' histories?
Well, they are very involved with a lot of contemporary movements. So, for example, there's a lot of movement back and forth with the Zapatistas and the people at the ZAD. They go over there. The Zapatistas come over. So there's that kind of contemporary exchange. One of the histories that they're very involved with is the history of their own region, which is in France the place of a deep history of radical agriculture, and that does not exist anywhere else in France, really. So you have, for example, I've been giving a lot of talks about '68 because that's the other 50th anniversary, and at this point now, I have absolutely no interest in what happened in Paris in '68, because what happened in Nantes was so much more interesting. There you had a coalition of students and workers and farmers, and the farmers were essential because they sort of fed the movement. There were existing networks in place when the workers went on strike for the farmers to come in and with the students to coordinate an entire means of bringing, food and milk into poor areas of the city, and so that particular coalition is something and history that the ZAD is very interested in, and that they are now reproducing themselves, because I'm sure you've heard about the current situation in France now with the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement. And, that's a big question mark. But initially, the ZAD many of the Gilets jaunes would have been against the ZAD, so there was a little bit of antagonism, but the ZAD decided to enact real solidarity with them, and they are now bringing food to the what are they called, the traffic circles, where the Gilets jaunes are demonstrating. So they're doing this in a conscious kind of reference to the history of Nantes in '68.
Hi, my name is Cher. I attend UND. I had a question about precisely this sort of the alliances and sort of how events have sort of, and I know in some of your work you've talked about the role of afterlives, and in places like Pakistan there's certain figures, anti-colonial figures or anarchist figures whose memory is kept out through students, through, I would say the sort of subculture that's sort of developed in those places. I myself am looking at railway workers and their alliances. When you talk about like the Paris Commune or the contemporary, there's a sort of continuity you see within that. What is that continuity, is my question.
I was trying to suggest that you could find it around this notion of communal luxury, which I think is an important set of practices to keep in mind in an era where wealthy states are just giving each other more money while advocating austerity for everyone else. So it's an interesting idea that you can use to talk about a number of the themes that I associated in the talk, like defense, like composition. And in the case of the Paris communards, one of the ways that I tried to open up that story was around this idea of communal luxury, and also by opening up the chronology, literally, by, not stopping with the massacre. And I think you always have to do that with these movements, because then you can begin to see the way in which an event exceeds its own history, and spills out and spills over. And in my book, I tried to see the way that it spilled out geographically and what happened when the refugees of the Commune, encountered people like Kropotkin and William Morris and even Marx. So that was just a way of opening things up in order to, not make it the tragedy of the massacre be the defining thing that everyone remembers about the Commune.
The other long-term rural occupation in the Americas that's not indigenous-based is the MST, the many, many occupations.
Yeah. I wish I knew more about that one.
Well, so we had the privilege this morning of hearing from the Brazilian geographer who's worked for 30 years with the MST, Bernardo Mancano Fernandes. Is Bernardo here tonight, or Sam? It's such a shame. I really would have loved to hear the two of you in conversation. He's been writing for 30 years about socio-territorial movements and the importance of understanding the relationship between social movements and territory.
What is his name?
Which is in general Mancano Fernandes, which is in general something that I think Latin American geographers and especially Brazilian geographers have really done a much better job than we have in Anglo geography. And I will again pitch to Antipode the importance of doing, and the difficulty, as we've long been talking about, of doing more translation into English. But I would encourage you to talk to him while he's here, and I would love to connect the two of you.
Yeah.
I'm kind of trying to articulate a question because, when you showed the grenades and talking about the movement, so much of that resistance is present in so many places of Latin America, right? That it's become kind of a way of life. Mm-hmm. The resistance, the state coming in so brutally. So it's been going on for a really long time. And I want to think about these movements but beyond identity, because some way these movements are, what the state is trying to do is precisely erase long histories, very long indigenous histories. There's a project of modernization that does not recognize or does not want to recognize things like communal luxuries as art or as aesthetic or as necessity, right? That those kinds of collectives are present. Mm-hmm. And as social scientists grapple with these movements, there is a tendency to kind of go into binaries, to kind of go to the past to retrieve something versus go future towards modernity. And so again, I'm sort of trying to articulate a question of how would one juxtapose these movements, not as identities, not as teleologies, but and again, sort of like, what is it that the French movement goes to the Zapatistas for? Mm-hmm. Right? Not as a recovery, but what is its material history?
I think the one very practical thing that they went to the Zapatistas was to figure out how to handle not how to handle disruptive people on the ZAD without having a police force. So how do you don't want to have courts, you don't want to have so how did they handle that very normal and real set of incidents that inevitably occurs? And so they went there and they found out, they used, I think, a model close to what the Zapatistas do, which is I don't know, but they got some kind of inspiration from them to draw 12 names out of a hat every month and have those people preside as a kind of not judgment, but a mediating force, so that people who had really intense complaints, usually about dogs, could go to this group, and this group would, attempt to come up with some sort of solution. But I remember that was something that they needed some sort of a way of looking at how other people had handled it without, you know, setting up little mini police forces or something like that. But there was something else about your question that I was thinking about.
Yeah, just sort of, you know, tragic. I'm trying to put these different movements in sort of the same frame, right? But not in the binary of modernity versus indigeneity. All of those categories are very much embedded.
Well, as geographers, how useful do you think the concept of territoriality is? I mean, I imagine it's a very fraught term for geographers and is one that's constantly coming up in different ways in your profession and your thinking. But I don't know if it's useful or not to start there. If you start there, what happens? It's always a question of where you begin. If you begin with the territory, what does that allow you to do?
Thank you for such an interesting lecture. I was listening to you, and I was remembering the discussions that we had about 20 years ago or 15 years ago about the alter globalization movement that resembles a lot what you are saying, a coalition of movements, a coalition of political cultures, picking up a kind of exemplary forms, occupiers in Barcelona, Centri Sociali in Italy, farmers like Jean Beauvais in France, Chiapas, Direct Action Network in the States with the Seattle battle in the streets, and then that great demonstrations of, I think it was Teamsters and Turtles in 1999. So it was this idea that you bring together different kinds of political cultures that are embedded in local and specific territories, and you bring them together. But somehow along the way, we lost the ability to pick up that forms of participation in those political cultures and bring it to other places. In about 2003, with the global demonstration against the Iraqi war, after that, the anti-global movement just collapsed. And what we are seeing now, and I don't want to be off topic, but I would really like to listen to what you could say about this, is the idea of defending what we have, which I think is a very powerful idea. But in fact, it seems is what is on the basis of our day's populism, left-wing populism or right-wing populism after 10 years of austerity policies. And so this idea that you want to defend what you have, a structure of relationships of power, a certain status, or something that is being taken from you through privatization. But we haven't been able to understand exactly how today these forms of populism being held in France with Marine Le Pen and Front National is the idea of defending France against also capitalism, are being transported to other territories as a form of defense. So my question is, how do we understand this need to defend our lives, this rage against the elites after 10 years of austerity policies, in a context where the idea of a coalition of political cultures that we had in the anti-globalized movement just collapsed, that just lost the impetus to be in the front row of the political conflict. I don't know if I'm explaining this well.
I kind of disagree with your history a little bit, or the way I would put it is that the anti-globalization movement collapsed for a good reason. Everyone got tired of flying to G8 meetings and having a big demonstration every time there was a G8 meeting. What does that do exactly, you know? I think there was a real, it was effective for a while, but after a while you say, well, how can we go on with that repetition? And instead, there was the need to precisely to sort of anchor political action in a defined space and not, you know, hop around to all these G8 meetings. And not have that define everything. In other words, start with what you have. Start with where you are.
I'm not only the winner, I'm actually the founding editor of Antipode. I was a grad student at Clark and was the first editor. So maybe it's kind of appropriate that I finish up. And let me finish up actually in the way that I started in 1968, with just something, a real dead, concrete question, just down to earth. And one of the things I really appreciate about your talk is how concrete, how rooted, how in the materiality and the reality of people's lives your work is. And I just commend that, and it inspires me. So, I mean, my question is, can you talk just a little bit more about daily life? Water supply, sanitation, what did they do when somebody got sick? Of the 200, how many were children? Were they homeschooled? Were there hassles over there not going to public school? I mean, there's so many ways this style of life and this occupation, this defensive action, could have been attacked from the point of view of school, law, sanitation, public health. So there's also that dynamic. But I'm just curious about the round of daily life. And the dogs and the sheep. Thank you.
They stole their electricity. They had no sewage. They had no toilets. There were some kids, more and more babies were born. Some of them were homeschooled and some of them were sent to public schools based on the parents' decision. There wasn't a real conflict about that, just people did what they wanted. The way people lived for the most, I mean, when I went there, I would stay in a caravan belonging to a guy who was in prison, and what they had were frequently would be people went off to sleep wherever they wanted to, you know, but then each group had a communal area for cooking and eating and living. It was small compounds of different sizes. Like, so you might have 4 women living in one, or you know, 7 adults and 2 kids, or, you know, it's different, very different according to affinities. People just, and sometimes there would be shifts in that over time. People would move, and also according to activity. You know, many people were much more involved, say, with working on maintaining and managing the forest and what was going to happen with the wood, which they didn't have that much of, and which, you know, and here's another example of the kinds of federation, because really the French rural areas are filled with experimental situations like this. It's the French countryside is so much more interesting than the cities right now because of these forgotten areas that the state went for a nap that lasted 20 years with some of these places, and because of that, you can get a lot done, you know, when the state is sleeping, in terms of just living very, very differently. And that's happening in all of these sort of forgotten places in the countryside, like the Ardennes or the Cévennes, or, you know, these mountains and forest areas where people are really coming up with brilliant ways of working together and just creating new forms of community. There's a group in Cévennes where, and these are not people that have a lot of money, but what they did was, the next time that a house went on the market, in order to prevent it becoming a second home for some Parisian or British person, you know, looking for a second home, they pulled together and bought it themselves and are renting it to someone who is really living there, you know, and who's living there all the time. Because desertification, or whatever you call it, you know, the depopulation of the countryside is such a problem. So yeah, daily life. Well, a lot of it is agriculturally oriented.
I think we better leave it there. Thanks to Kristen Ross for the talk. Thank you for coming.